Okay, this is going to be an entry-level guide or introduction to Preservation Evoker. This is aimed at people who have not played beta, who are picking up the spec for the first time, or want a general idea of how the spec plays to decide whether or not it's something that they would be interested in. I'm not going to go through the whole spec talent by talent. I feel like that kind of video is just too boring, and there are far more experienced people to offer that sort of analysis. So for this video, it's going to be a general overview. I'm going to try and answer the question, is preservation for you? And then at the end of the video, I'll also talk about where I think preservation stands compared to other healers, more than anything with Mythic Plus in mind, especially now that the latest round of significant buffs have come through for preservation defensives and self-healing and a few other little changes. So to start out, what does Preservation's basic toolkit look like? Well, they have a instant cast hot they can cast on someone called Reversion. By default, it lasts for 12 seconds. It has a 9-second recharge, and every time it ticks every 2 seconds. Every time it ticks and that tick crits, it will add 1 extra tick onto its duration. You can also talent to have this as 2 charges and a few other little perks like 10% additional healing on targets with Reversion on them and things like that. So you have a kind of spot or tank heal over time, and then you have your essence. Now by default you have 5 essence. I've talented into having 6. Naturally you regenerate 1 essence every 5 seconds, reduced by haste. So it's almost like a holy power system, I guess, that builds up over time instead of you having to build it. You can then choose to spend your essence on 2 healing abilities or a damage ability. The healing abilities are Emerald Blossom, which looks like this. You just target it on a player, it's a big AoE, heals up to 5 people standing in the AoE. Each Emerald Blossom spends 3 essence. Or you can spend your essence on Echo, which is a 1.5 second base cast that applies a buff to an ally. It also has a small heal attached to it, and then the buff lasts 18 seconds, and basically the next healing spell you press on anyone will be replicated onto targets that have Echo on them, and it costs 2 essence. And finally, you can spend essence on a damaging ability called Disintegrate. It doesn't do anything, it's just a single target channel that deals damage, but it has no other like interaction any of the rest of your spec. It's just a damage dump. If you talent for it, you can cause it to give you back a little bit of mana, but for the most part, it's just a damage dump. So apart from your essence abilities, you have your empowered spells. 2 of them heal, 1 of them deals damage. The damaging one is Fire Breath. Now all of your empowered spells are baseline 3.5 second casts. Have to stand still while casting them, even if you use Hover, which is your mobility spell, which also allows casting while moving. That casting while moving effect doesn't apply to empowered spells. It's only your filler spells that you can do that with. So your empowered spells have a fancy cast bar. Basically, the longer you cast them, the more powerful they become. As of the latest round of changes, it isn't really about power for your empowerment level or how long you cast your empowered spells. It's more about what kind of damage or healing pattern you want those spells to take. So Fire Breath, for example, you can cast it all the way up to maximum empowerment, and it will do the most upfront damage with a small dot attached to enemies in a frontal cone. And then if you release it or cast the spell at a lower level of empowerment, it will do the same overall damage, but it will have less upfront damage and a larger dot portion tacked onto the back of it. Looks like this. Fire Breath has a 30-second cooldown. Your other 2 empowered spells are Dream Breath, that functions very similarly to Fire Breath, but it's a heal. It's a much larger AoE. So Dream Breath looks like this. Larger heal, heals up to 5 targets in the area. The higher level of empowerment, the more upfront healing, and the lower level of empowerment will do the same amount of healing, but it will be less upfront and more hot-based. And your final empowered spell is Spirit Bloom. Spirit Bloom is not an AoE like the other 2. It is a casted spell or empowered spell that you cast on an ally. And for each level of empowerment past the first, it will cleave that heal to an extra ally. And it looks kind of like this. Now you can talent for your Spirit Bloom to have a 20-second cooldown instead of a 30, but by default, all of your empowered spells will have a 30-second cooldown. You also get a neat little 2-minute cooldown that will give you a instant cast maximum empowerment version of your next empowered spell. And your filler spells are Azure Strike, which by default hits 2 enemies. It's just an instant cast spammable damage spell that has no interaction with the rest of your spec, but it just does damage. And the other one is Living Flame. This is your filler. If this is cast on an enemy, it does damage. If it's cast on an ally, it heals. There's a 2-second base cast time, and that is the basic fundamental healing toolkit of Preservation Evoker. Now, when playing Preservation, what you're really trying to do is weave those 3 different styles together. You're looking to use your empowered spells for your large burst healing moments or healing requirements, and between that, you're spending your essence as you see fit to do damage or to heal, and then when you're not doing either of those things, you're spamming your filler abilities or you're using your shorter term cooldown abilities. Now with talents, those short term cooldowns are going to be Verdant Embrace, which is I believe an 18-second cooldown reduced by haste. Wowhead says 24, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong, at least at the moment. And this is a very large spot heal, like 300+% spell power healing. On an 18-second cooldown, you use it on an ally. If you fly to them, you heal them. You can also grab a talent that will basically bind your health to the target you fly to, and it will replicate 40% of the healing you do in the subsequent 5 seconds onto that target. I think that's actually onto both targets. So yourself and your target. It doesn't say in the tooltip, but Verdant Embrace can also be used on yourself for a large spot heal. You also have the option of talenting into Temporal Anomaly. Now, Temporal Anomaly, for those who are familiar, functions a lot like Frozen Orb from Diablo. You shoot it out from basically in front of you. It's a relatively large AoE that moves forward. Now, if it doesn't hit an ally, it moves quite quickly. But as soon as it comes into contact with an ally, it slows. It lasts for 6 seconds, and in that 6 seconds, it will tick 3 times. Each time it ticks, it will apply quite a hefty absorb shield to 2 allies. You can talent this up to 3 allies with every pulse. So you can get effectively 9 pulses of shields in 3 stacks on 3 targets. And it does stack. It costs a metric ton of mana. So it isn't an ability you want to use often, but for setting up for incoming damage, it can be exceptionally powerful. You also have a tank cooldown called Time Dilation. A minute cooldown, you effectively stagger 50% of the incoming damage an ally would take over 8 seconds. This can be talented up to a 70% stagger, or you can talent it for reduced cooldown. Now there's a couple of other perks here and there, but the general gameplay is pretty much what I've outlined so far. You're using your essence spenders, you're using your empowered casts, and you're dealing damage and healing at the same time. Now Preservation is unique, I would say, amongst healers in that it really doesn't spam spells. I mean, if you really want to, I guess you can spam Living Flame or Azure Strike a lot, but for the most part, you're juggling 6 or 7, 8 spells, and you're picking the right time to use it and the right combinations of those spells. Now, I think this actually gives Preservation quite a lot of depth, and I was critical of Preservation in the past, mostly because its empowered spells weren't really empowered spells. They weren't spells that you picked the empowerment level you wanted to cast them at. They were just 3.5-second casts that you always wanted to cast at max empowerment. But since that's changed, I would say the spec has become much more dynamic. You get to pick if you want to apply heavy hot healing or heavy upfront healing, if you want to heal people in 30 yards around you spread out all over the place, or you want to heal people who are stacked up together. You have a lot of options. Now, as far as adding on to the basic framework that I've outlined with talents, you can talent further into extra cooldowns or large raid heals like Dreamflight. You get to pick a large area you want to fly over and you just bomb people with massive heals as you fly. You also get a damage version of this in Deep Breath. Both have 2-minute cooldowns. You also have Bloodlust, and your raid cooldown is basically a juiced up revival. It doesn't have the dispel mechanic, but it's an instant cast, small heal on the whole raid with a large what would you say, like utility or extra effect added onto it. Now Revival gets the Dispel, but Rewind gets something way more just raw throughput powerful, which is 50% of the damage taken in the last 5 seconds is healed back. Now this is crazy strong. Like incredibly strong at the moment. This feels a lot like if you were able to pack a whole Tranquility into a single global, or a whole Divine Hymn or something like that into a single global. It's just very, very, very strong. Same with the tank cooldowns, also very strong. They also get neat little things like Cauterizing Flame, which is a 1-minute cooldown. Universal Dispel, dispels bleeds, poisons, curses, diseases, everything. And tacks a chunky heal onto a target as well. They can talent into an interrupt like everybody else except the priest healing specs. It's a ranged interrupt too, which is actually quite nice. It's a longer cooldown at 40 seconds. Their party buff is a 15% cooldown reduction of mobility spells for their allies. Now there are a couple of other spells, I guess, that they can talent into, but I mean, for the sake of this video, without having to go through every single talent, that is the basic premise of Preservation. You are using your spells in combination with each other for different scenarios and picking the spell that best fits the incoming damage patterns at any given time. Now the throughput of all of these spells, when used, I would say like quite well, is extremely high. Like possibly the highest throughput of any healer at the moment in beta, especially for stacked AoE healing. Emerald Blossom is just crazy, crazy strong. You can talent into a couple of ways of making this even better with like random. It has a chance to randomly proc another one of itself. It has an extra heal tacked onto it. It has a self heal tacked onto it, like a significant one, 250% spell power healing on yourself every time you use Emerald Blossom, which is nuts. Now, as far as stats go, the Preservation Mastery is a little bit misleading because it reads that healing done to allies is increased by whatever percentage of your mastery, while their health percentage is lower than your own. So people who are more injured than you heal more. Now, this isn't like Shaman's Mastery where it's dependent on the health percentage or difference. It's just a straight up full mastery bonus to any heal on any target that has a lower percentage health than yours. It doesn't matter if they're 1% lower or 90% lower. It's the same bonus. What it doesn't say in the tooltip is that all of your self-healing as a Preservation Evoker, all of the healing you do to yourself is increased by the full effect of mastery. Now this doesn't really sound like much, and I think Blizzard have kind of done themselves a disservice by not putting this in the tooltip, because this allows Preservation Mastery to almost activate itself. As an example, if you're in a situation where the whole group is at like full health and then they all get hit, everyone gets hit by a big damaging ability for roughly the same amount, and everyone ends up at roughly the same health, and you start healing them back. Generally, you wouldn't get the full benefit of your mastery, but with the way Preservation is built and the kind of self-healing options it has built into some of its spells, it means that as soon as you start AoE healing, you will gain more health than your allies, or you will gain health at a quicker rate than your allies, because your self-healing will always get the full benefit of mastery. And then once your health is a little bit higher than your allies, you now get the full benefit of mastery on all of your allies. As far as defensives go, these were by far the weakest part of the Preservation toolkit until yesterday. And defensives is another area of Preservation that I was extremely critical of in the past. Their defensives just weren't good, they just didn't work. But that has changed significantly. I would say Preservation is going from the weakest defensive healer in the game to one of the strongest. And that is because Obsidian Scales has been redesigned. So it now is a 30% flat DR, lasts 12 seconds, which is longer than pretty much every other class's defensive. Has a 90-second cooldown. Now this is in like quite a good sweet spot in my opinion. Most of the 20% DRs that other classes have a shorter cooldown, so a minute, and the bigger ones, like Shaman's Wall Astral Shift, has a much longer cooldown and is a 40% DR. Now, 30% DR on a 90-second cooldown is in and of itself quite good, I would say. That's competitive. But what it gets also is a talent that allows you to have 2 charges. Now, in my opinion, this is pretty huge. Evokers are just straight up defensive with these 2 nodes. They're competitive with other classes' defensives. When you throw in things like high spot healing and Panacea to get your 250% spell power heal on all of your Emerald Blossoms, and a 75% armor buff that Blizzard threw in to make Evoker armor pool match more similarly to Shamans, who also wear mail but don't get a shield. And then you throw in things like Renewing Blaze, which was significantly buffed. Renewing Blaze has been buffed so much that it went from being a defensive that was so bad it was difficult to compare it to other defensives, to being a defensive that is now so good that it might as well read something along the lines of, I mean, obviously this is under optimal use, but unless you're taking more than 25% of your health as damage per second, you won't die. And that is a lot of incoming damage that a 1 minute cooldown ability can just allow you to live through. Really, really strong. You also get a pseudo defensive in Emerald Communion if you really want it. You can also get a shield for 30% of your health, and your same for an ally every minute with rescue. Overall, defensively, Preservation is quite good. Mobility wise is a little bit lacking. You basically have to talent into everything you can to make hover good, because hover is your only mobility. Now you can talent hover to have 2 charges and last, I believe, 12 seconds. And you can also talent for it to give you a 70% movement speed buff in the first couple of seconds of using it. Preservation also gets a double jump like Demon Hunters. Now, if you just stand still and press spacebar twice, it'll shoot you forward a little bit, which is quite nice. And obviously it gives you the slow fall glide kind of effect as well. Being Drakthir means you also get a knock up and a knock back, both on 90-second cooldowns with a few talent options to make them knock farther, or pick one of them to have a shorter cooldown. You also get Soar and Dragon Riding kind of stuff and all that. Now I guess the real question of where do I think Preservation compares, or how do I think Preservation compares to other healers at the moment? As of a couple of weeks ago, I would have put it in as probably the worst healer in beta. That being said, I think all healers are honestly quite good. I don't think there's a lot of difference between them, which I guess I can also highlight by saying that now, after the last round of changes, I would put Preservation squarely in the S tier. They have absolutely exceptional cooldowns. The remove everything dispel, the tank external, and rewind are all just extremely strong cooldowns. They have very, very high stacked throughput. They have no mana issues whatsoever. They do a lot of damage in keys without having to really spend much time or resources or anything on doing it. They have excellent spot healing. All that being said though, they are extremely reliant on good positioning. What I guess I haven't mentioned is that all of their healing spells at the moment have a 30-yard range, which feels much better than a 25-yard range. Even doing a couple of heroics for footage for this video, I found that there were quite a few boss fights in rooms that at the 25-yard range, I always found half of my group was out of range on. But with a 30-yard range, most people are in range of my healing most of the time. The downside of the range at the moment is that all of Preservation's damaging abilities are still set at 25 yards. It's not a huge deal or deal breaker or anything. It would be nice to see them all be universally 30. But at the moment, like I said, I mean, it's difficult to find fault with Preservation at the moment. You have options of going into heavy absorb healing or heavy stacked AoE healing, heavy spot healing. You have built-in quite good self-healing. Your mastery is extremely powerful for raw throughput. You deal good damage, have good utility, have no mana issues. The weakest link at the moment for Preservation in my eyes is their mobility. I think a huge part of that has been alleviated with the changes to the empowered spells scaling, and now that it's viable in a lot of situations to use them at like rank 1 empowerment instead of maximum rank, and especially with their defensives being brought up to par. I think they're just in an exceptionally good spot. I find them very, very fun to play at the moment. It's a bit difficult to test them at the moment in heroics because they're just, people are very, very overgeared for them on beta and there isn't much to heal. So I'm looking forward to the next round of Mythic Plus to come out next weekend to test Preservation a lot more. But for now, that'll be it. I might do a more in-depth, boring video where I go through Preservation talent by talent. For now, I hope I've answered the question of is Preservation something you might be interested in. Thanks for watching, and algorithm stuff.